So let's talk about the House of Lords. We've already learned about Parliament as a whole and how the Commons works, but here it is, the House of Lords, the big, archaic, old-fashioned, beautiful, strange part of our parliamentary system that is definitely a hang-up of the way our system has evolved over time. Like if you were to create a brand new country and write a brand new constitution, there is no way that you would come up with the House of Lords as an idea or a principle. But in many ways, it works, and it is a successful part of our parliamentary system. It's controversial. Some people love it, some people hate it, some people think, well, it's an unusual idea, but it kind of works. And in this video, we'll be talking about what exactly it is, what its role is, and perhaps some of the ways in which it might be reformed in the future. As always, there's various additional reading you can do, and unfortunately, the House of Lords section is kind of split throughout the textbook, so I've given a huge reference there, page 208 to 229. I'm not expecting you to read all of that this week, but if you kind of find all of the bits within there where it mentions something to do with the House of Lords, and take some study of that. So what does the House of Lords do? Well, in the American system, as I've mentioned before, you have two equally powerful houses, Congress, House of Representatives, of equal power. But we don't have that in the UK. We very much have a Commons, which is elected, and a House of Lords, which is not. Therefore, the Lords doesn't legitimise decisions that have been taken by your representatives. So last week we talked about how the House of Commons is there to legitimise tax rises, law changes, so you know that you vote for your local representative, and then your local representative either votes for or against these law changes, and it legitimizes these legal changes. The House of Lords doesn't have that. You don't choose members of the House of Lords, neither do I. We don't vote for them. We have no choice in them. We can't remove them. So it doesn't legitimize any decisions they make. Therefore, the House of Lords has kind of become known as a revising chamber. It helps with amendments, it helps to investigate, it helps to improve legislation, perhaps to make the House of Commons think again or think harder about something that they're trying to take through. But this phrase of the House of Lords as being a revising chamber is one which is one that you could talk about in the essay. Now, technically, it's not like the House of Lords is a revising chamber, but it's in political reality, that is what it does. And just like the House of Commons, it does do huge amounts of scrutiny in committees. Now, it doesn't have select committees in the same way, but it still has committees where they talk and they investigate and they improve bills and they improve legislation. But what powers does it actually have? Well, it has the power to delay legislation. It used to have the power to, it used to be an equal chamber with the Commons. Then in the Parliament Act 1911 or 1919, check my dates on that one, it was reduced so it could delay for 2 years, and then in 1949 it was reduced further so it could only delay for 1 year. Now, the reason I've chosen that particular photo is because there haven't been all that many occasions over the last 20, 30 years where they have actually delayed a bill. But one of them was when they lowered the age of consent for gay men down to 16. The House of Lords disagreed with it for various kind of moral, religious reasons, and they voted against it, and so that particular bill was delayed for a year. Now, we're going to get into some kind of technical elements of our lawmaking system here. But in our system, there is something called primary legislation and secondary legislation. Now, primary legislation is all the acts and the bills that you've been learning about so far, and anything you see people voting on in Parliament is primary legislation. But once a bill has been passed, there is actually kind of little tinkering that the ministers and various executive organisations can do, which is known as secondary legislation. Now, this doesn't actually need to go through Parliament unless it's particularly controversial. Let me give you an example. See the picture here with a speed limit sign on it. Parliament, as part of its primary legislation, ruled that the executive is able to set speed limits. So, primary legislation, you can set speed limits. But secondary legislation would be when they actually set what that speed limit would be. And that doesn't need to go through the House of Commons and the House of Lords in the same way. It doesn't need the same scrutiny and investigation, and because that would take a huge amount of time. So these are like little tweaks that have gone through existing bills to which Parliament has already agreed for. Now the Commons, because all of the members there are elected and they have many responsibilities, doesn't have time to look at secondary legislation. But the Lords does. The Lords is less busy, has more experts in particular different areas, and so the Lords spends a lot of its time looking at these little changes that the executive does in secondary legislation, and most of the time just approving or agreeing with, but definitely scrutinising and holding to account when necessary. And on occasion, the Lords have come forward and said, hang on, this secondary legislation is not okay, this is unacceptable, this is causing various problems, it needs to be looked at by the whole House, and they've kind of brought things to the fore in that way. And the other role of the House of Lords is that it provides expertise. Many members of the House of Lords have either had amazing careers in politics, which is a major one, in business, in entertainment. They come from all areas of life, albeit mainly politics, and they bring that huge amount of experience with them. You've got a picture there of Lady Thatcher, who died about 10 years or so ago. Obviously, she was Prime Minister for 10 years. She became a Baroness afterwards, and therefore was able to provide expertise and her knowledge and her wisdom and her experience and so on, as do almost all of the others, which is why they are there. So that's the functions of the House of Lords. You'll notice that a lot of them, in a way, are kind of unofficial. So the fact this revising thing, the scrutiny thing, the secondary legislation, the expertise things, these aren't really constitutional powers. They're just kind of things that have happened. There's a car alarm that's just gone off outside the window. Hopefully that's not causing a problem for the video. So what happens if we compare the House of Commons with the House of Lords? Like, what powers do they both have? What are the Lords only, and what are the Commons only? Well, let's start with looking at the powers that both houses share. They both debate. You've seen it on TV, I'm sure. They both stand in either the Green Chamber, which is the Commons, or the Red Chamber, which is the Lords, and they talk lots and they have debates. And yes, the debates might not necessarily have a massive impact, but it's a place to air these viewpoints. It's a place to hear experts on various topics talk. So debates are important. They can both propose amendments to various bills. The government doesn't necessarily have to accept them or include them, but they can both propose them. They both scrutinise the executive, so they can both interview ministers, they can both set up committees to investigate particular bits of wrongdoing or new bills or whatever it might be. And they can both debate the key issues of the day, meaning they could summon a minister for perhaps maybe an urgent question, or they can talk about a war that the country has just gone on to, or some sort of recent emergency, such as the Occupy London movement, which is going on now with the Extinction Rebellion. They can both debate key things that is going on. They can both introduce private members' bills. We mentioned this last week. So MPs and Lords can both, a few times a year, can introduce legislation of their own. Most of the time it fails. Most of the time it never kind of goes anywhere. But they do both technically have that power. So there's our similarities. They can both do all of those things. But this is where you're really going to see how much more powerful the Commons has ended up being than the Lords. First of all, it is the Commons that have the final approval and rejection of bills. The Lords, as you know, they can delay. So ultimately, the final yes and no comes from the Commons, and they don't really need the Lords' approval or disapproval. They have that power. Parliamentary sovereignty. There you go, use that phrase. It is also the Commons that can call a vote of no confidence in the government. We had one a few weeks ago, potentially happening to Boris. We had one about a year ago happening to Theresa May. That all takes place in the Commons. The Lords has no system whereby it can remove the government. Select committees only takes place in the Commons. Now, if I phrased it badly earlier, both of them have committees, but that specific department-based select committee system only exists in the Lords. Anything to do with budget, finance, taxation, all that kind of stuff, by convention, the Lords has no opinion on and doesn't get involved with. There's an old phrase used in America, which is no taxation without representation. The idea being that only the elected chamber should really deal with anything to do with money. And ultimately, Parliament is sovereign, the Commons is sovereign within Parliament, and therefore the Commons can reform the Lords, but the Lords never gets to reform the Commons. And so when they removed hereditary peers, when the Lords' powers were reduced in 1949, all of that came through the Commons. And yes, the Lords agreed with it and acquiesced with it, but ultimately they don't have full control there. So what powers do the Lords have by themselves? Well, not a lot, really. What's kind of left? The Lords have the power to delay. The Lords spend a lot of their time doing this secondary legislation thing. Now, that's not really a power so much, but it is what they spend their time doing, so I guess that's fine. But here's one that's perhaps a bit more interesting to discuss. Now, in the Commons, you have very, very powerful party whips. This means that the Conservative Party MPs nearly always vote with the Conservative leader, not always, Brexit, and the Labour Party MPs nearly always vote along way with the whichever way Jeremy Corbyn tells them to do, or whoever is the leader when you're watching this video. But in the Lords, there's far less. The whips are far less powerful. The Lords are far more free-thinking. They're a bit older. They can't be removed. They can't be deselected or de-elected, and therefore they do tend to vote far more along the lines with what they genuinely think. Now, if you are a Conservative Lord, then you're probably going to vote with the Conservatives most of the time because you are Conservative, but you're not forced to in the same way. There's not the same threats or the same repercussions or issues or so on. So the party whips have less power, which means perhaps the Lords are a bit more, strangely, democratic in an unelected way. But there is this thing called the Salisbury Convention that has a huge impact on what the Lords might interfere with or try and amend or try and delay with, and it's named after a person called Lord Salisbury, which has been a convention since the 1940s. The logic of it works like this. The government makes certain promises when elected. These promises are known as a manifesto, and normally that manifesto is an actual book or document that is kind of given out, or you can find it online, and it'll say something like the Liberal Democrat Manifesto. There'll be a picture of the party leader or some sort of exciting inspirational picture, and you'll open it up, and inside will be the list of what they promise to do if elected. Now, this manifesto has been voted for by the people. Therefore, the unelected Lords shouldn't stop the will of the people in our country, in a democratic country. So put it all together, and therefore the Lords won't block anything that's in this manifesto. I think my use of apostrophe there is not correct. So the Salisbury Convention, in short, is they won't block anything in the manifesto. So if Boris Johnson calls an election tomorrow and he says in it, we will take Britain out of Europe with a no-deal Brexit, and then he is elected, there's a democratic mandate for that, and the Lords, by convention, won't block it, won't stand in their way. Now, as you should know from talking about constitution, conventions can be broken. This is a convention, not a rule. So they could stand in its way, they could try and delay it, but they almost certainly won't. Salisbury Convention, very important thing to talk about when discussing the relationship between the Commons and the Lords. That said, although they don't stand in the way of things which are in the manifesto, lots and lots of bills come through that aren't in the manifesto, and they kind of arise in the following years. So, for example, let's say I get elected tomorrow and I'm Prime Minister. I'm going to be Prime Minister for probably 5 years, and therefore there will be lots of things, especially in the 3rd, 4th and 5th year, that weren't in my manifesto that I want to do. And that's when the Lords will start to have a lot more to say about it. Now, when hereditary peers were removed in 1999, and I think we've talked about this in class, but the House of Lords used to be made up of hereditary members, meaning my father was Lord Cox of whatever, blah, 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 and now he's dead, and now I am Lord Cox of blah, 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 and I get to sit in the House of Lords. Hereditary meaning passed down from father to son or father to daughter. Most of the hereditaries were removed by Tony Blair in 1999, and now there's only 92 remaining, something like that. But the interesting side effect was when the hereditary peers were removed, the House of Lords actually became more legitimate. Not legitimate in that it's democratically elected, but in that it has real expertise. Everyone there now is there because they've provided a public service or because they are an expert, and the House of Lords since 1999 has become more active. They have become more likely to block the government, to propose amendments, to just kind of have a voice. And so the House of Lords has actually become increasingly powerful as a revising chamber, more active as a in holding the government to account, and arguably a more important part of British politics. And there's some good documentaries you can watch about the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And one of the arguments made in that is that the House of Commons just tends to vote along party lines, but the real work, the real analysis, the real discussion of bills, the real scrutiny of bills takes place in the Lords. An interesting argument, perhaps one for you to research and form an opinion on yourself. Now, this is a picture of ping pong bats, table tennis. There's a phrase in the Houses of Parliament which is known as ping pong, because if the House of Commons votes for something, let me grab some pens here. If the House of Commons votes for something, it then gets physically taken to the House of Lords. And I do mean physically. They pick up the bill and they walk it to the House of Lords. And then the House of Lords votes for it as well, and that's how you make a law. But what if the House of Lords votes no? Well, you already know that they can only delay, but what actually happens? Well, what actually happens is this. Commons votes yes, probably. The Lords vote no, so then it goes back to the Commons, and the Commons will say, no, really, we insist, and then the Lords can vote no, and then it goes round and round and round. And this is known as ping pong. Ping, pong, ping, pong, ping, pong. It gets sent between the houses. Now, what might happen, for example, let me give you some scenarios. Commons votes yes, Lords votes no for a specific reason and sends it back with an amendment. The Commons goes, okay, fair enough, we like your amendment. They ping it back with the amendment. The Lord says, thank you very much, and it goes through both houses. Scenario number 2. This one also is quite common. Commons votes yes, Lords votes no. Commons says, no, really, we are the democratic elected house, we want this law. The Lord says, all right then, fine, and they vote yes. And there's actually quite a large amount of occasions where they vote yes on the second vote. It's almost like a kind of a, we think you should think again, are you sure? Yes, we are, or maybe, no, we're not sure, and so it goes. Another scenario might be this. Commons votes yes, Lords votes no, and then it's the Commons that says, you know what, there isn't enough will at the moment, there isn't enough time before the next general election, this is a low priority for us, maybe you have made us think again about this bill, and so they don't vote no, but they don't really kind of deal with that bill anymore. And this whole process is known as ping pong, ping pong. Use that phrase in the exam about how bills can be ping-ponged through the Commons. I should probably find some real examples of where these things have happened, but hopefully you get the principle of how that might happen. Again, good for talking about the relationship between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So who are these members of the House of Lords? I've been using terms such as hereditary peers, life peers, etc., etc. Well, here they are. So the first of all is the vast majority of members of the House of Lords are what we call life peers. The technical term is Lord Temporal, I believe, which means they are a lord only for them, only for their life. And when they die, their title dies with them. So if I was a life peer, I am Lord Cox. But when I die, because I'm a life peer, that life is over and the title disappears too. This is a lady called Floella Benjamin. She was a kids' TV presenter when I was a kid. She's awesome. And she's done work in television, in charity work, in politics, and she was made a baroness in the late 2010, somewhere around 2010, and so she's now there to bring her experience in the entertainment, charity and political industry to the House of Lords, and has done so very, very successfully. And there's lots and lots of people like her. Lord Sugar for services to business, Lord Andrew Lloyd Webber for services to music, and then loads and loads of political ones. Now, one of the criticisms of the House of Lords is it's kind of like a retirement home for politicians. Lots and lots of cabinet ministers and MPs end up going to the House of Lords as a kind of, almost like a way of kind of removing them. And there used to kind of be a joke that when a Prime Minister wanted to get rid of an MP or a Cabinet Minister, he would promote them to the House of Lords, which gives them this quite nice kind of cushy job and a bit of kind of money and a retirement, but it's also a way of kind of saying, you know, get out of the way. Perhaps it's not so that anymore, but the vast majority of the members of the House of Lords have been nominated by the Conservative Party or the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats. It is full of old ministers. Keep an eye. I mean, the people who are ministers today, especially the older ones, will almost certainly end up in the House of Lords at some point. And then there is 92 hereditary peers. Now, the House of Lords used to be full of hereditaries. In fact, they used to be all hereditaries if you go back far enough. But now most of them are gone, and there's only 92 left. And that was because of a compromise between the Blair government and others. There's also 26 Lord Spirituals. These are all members of the Church of England. They rarely speak in the House of Lords, and if they do, it's only on moral issues. I don't think they ever actually vote, but you could certainly have a discussion about how representative the House of Lords is if it only has the kind of members of the Church of England. You know, where are the Muslims, where's the Jewish representatives, where's the Catholic representatives? But they're there because of the connection between Henry VIII and being in charge of the Church of England. It's all that kind of connection between the monarch and the church is how they've kind of ended up being there in terms of the evolutionary process of the UK. But there is one thing which makes the House of Lords quite unique in that in the House of Commons, everyone is a member of a political party. Technically, they don't have to be, but in reality, they all are. You've got Labour, you've got Conservatives, Lib Debs, DUP, Sinn Féin. But in the House of Lords, you get this huge group of people called crossbenchers. And if I show you this pie chart here, you can see that most members of the House of Lords are connected to a party of some kind. So you can see the Labours, the Conservatives, etc., etc. But there's 178 crossbenchers. This means people that have no political link at all, or they don't vote with a particular party. And what you'll see here is that no party has an overall majority in the House of Lords, which means there's always has to be an element of compromise and scrutiny and working together to kind of get things through. And this is definitely unique to the Lords, that you get these crossbenchers, and B, no party has an overall majority in the Lords, which has its own strengths and its own weaknesses.